Not every Hollywood secret is real, but some are so strange. They feel real anyway. For decades, rumors have claimed certain Golden Age stars were hiding something impossible, that their identities were completely fabricated from the ground up. But what if the truth is even more unsettling? Not that they were secretly someone else, but that Hollywood was powerful enough to make you believe anything about them, without you ever questioning it. There's no real evidence behind those claims, but what Hollywood did hide is far more disturbing. Rita Hayworth's femininity in Hollywood wasn't always natural. Sometimes it was constructed. Rita Hayworth is remembered as effortless beauty, soft features, balanced elegance, a presence that felt naturally feminine. But that version didn't exist at the beginning. Born Margarita Cancino, her original look didn't match what studios believed a leading woman should be. So adjustments were made, deliberate, precise. Her hairline was altered. Her coloring changed. Her entire presentation shifted toward a more acceptable standard. And it worked. So completely that the transformation disappeared. What audiences saw felt real, untouched, authentic, but it wasn't. Because in Golden Age Hollywood, even something as fundamental as how feminine someone appeared could be redesigned until no one questioned it. Marlene Dietrich. Some illusions weren't about hiding. They were about control. Marlene Dietrich understood something most stars didn't, that femininity and masculinity weren't fixed on screen. They could be adjusted, shifted, balanced. In one scene, she appeared unmistakably feminine, composed, distant, untouchable. In another, she wore tailored suits, adopting a presence that felt structured, almost masculine. The shift was intentional. Dietrich controlled posture, voice, eye contact. Each detail guided how the audience interpreted what they were seeing, and they followed. Because perception doesn't need to be forced. It only needs to be guided. At a time when Hollywood enforced rigid expectations, she moved between them without breaking either completely. That was the illusion. Not confusion, precision. Once perception becomes flexible, you stop seeing it as fixed at all. Greta Garbo. Some stars are immediately understood. Greta Garbo wasn't. There was something about her presence that resisted definition. Not clearly soft, not sharply structured. Something quieter, controlled, unreadable. And that ambiguity became the illusion. Garbo's performances relied on restraint, minimal movement, limited expression. A voice that remained steady, almost neutral. It removed clear signals, leaving audiences to interpret what they were seeing. And when interpretation replaces clarity, curiosity increases. Hollywood didn't correct this. It preserved it. Lighting softened her features. Dialogue remained minimal. Her presence, rather than identity, became the focus. What audiences connected with wasn't traditional femininity. It was something less defined, less explainable, and that made it stronger. Eventually, something resists clear definition. It becomes harder to question what it really is. Katherine Hepburn. Not every illusion makes someone fit the mold. Some replace it. Katherine Hepburn didn't present femininity the way Hollywood expected. She was direct, controlled, assertive in a way that felt almost confrontational. Her voice wasn't delicate. Her posture wasn't passive. And yet, it worked. Instead of changing her, Hollywood adjusted around her. Costuming shifted. Dialogue sharpened. Her presence became the new reference point. The illusion wasn't softness. It was authority, presented through a woman without being reduced. And audiences adapted. Because once a new version is repeated enough, it starts to feel natural. That's how perception changes. Not instantly, but consistently. And once it changes, the old version starts to feel artificial instead. Joan Crawford. Control on screen can look like confidence, but it can also be constructed. Joan Crawford's image wasn't built on softness. It was built on structure, sharp lighting, defined features. expressions that never fully relaxed. Everything about her presence felt intentional, because it was. Makeup emphasized angles. Costuming reinforced strength. Even stillness became part of the performance, never uncertain, never passive. The result wasn't traditional femininity. It was something more controlled, more dominant, and audiences accepted it, because repetition creates belief. Once a presence is seen the same way again and again, it stops feeling guided. It starts feeling real. Jean Harlow. Softness can feel natural, but sometimes it's built. Jean Harlow's image was defined by lightness. Platinum hair, smooth features, a presence that felt open and effortless. But that softness wasn't accidental. Lighting erased harshness. Costuming avoided structure. Her voice remained light, controlled, never threatening. Every detail worked toward one goal, making femininity feel natural. And that's what made it effective. Because when something feels natural, it isn't questioned. But nothing about it was unplanned. The illusion wasn't obvious. It worked so well. No one realized they were looking at a constructed version. And once something blends into expectation, it becomes invisible. Bette Davis. Power wasn't expected from women on screen. So when it appeared, it had to be reframed. Bette Davis didn't soften her presence. She intensified it. Her gaze challenged. Her voice confronted. Her energy refused to settle into comfort. And instead of changing her, Hollywood built around it. Lighting sharpened her features. Dialogue leaned into conflict. Costuming removed softness. The result wasn't traditional femininity. It was controlled intensity. And over time, audiences adjusted, because what's repeated enough becomes expected. Veronica Lake. Sometimes illusion doesn't reveal more. It hides more. Veronica Lake's signature look, hair falling across one eye, wasn't just style. It was control, a deliberate choice that limited how much of her could be read at once. Expression became restrained. Reaction stayed subtle. Half her face remained just out of reach. And that created intrigue, because what's partially hidden feels more complex than what's fully visible. The audience fills in the gaps, projecting depth where detail is missing. That's where the illusion strengthens. Her femininity wasn't defined by what she revealed. It was shaped by what she withheld. The unseen became part of the identity. And over time, that concealment stopped feeling like a choice. And it became expectation. Something audiences recognized instantly, without questioning why it worked. Hedy Lamarr. Some images feel too perfect to question, and that's why they work. Hedy Lamarr's beauty wasn't just captured, it was constructed with precision. Lighting softened every edge, removing shadows that might suggest imperfection. Framing emphasized symmetry, keeping her features balanced and uninterrupted. Even her movements were controlled, slow enough to preserve the image from distortion. Nothing disrupted it. And that consistency made it convincing. Because when an image appears flawless, the audience stops analyzing it. They accept it as natural, even when it isn't. But perfection creates distance. It feels elevated, untouchable, less human, more ideal. And that's what made it powerful. Not just how it looked, but how carefully it was maintained. Because perfection, when repeated enough, stops feeling constructed. It simply feels real. Mae West. Mae West didn't soften femininity. She controlled it. Mae West turned presence into precision. Every movement slowed, just enough to hold attention. Every word was placed carefully, delivered with timing that felt deliberate rather than spontaneous. Even her pauses weren't empty. They carried intention, stretching moments until the audience leaned in. Nothing about it was passive. Her posture remained steady, never uncertain. Her gaze held, rather than avoided. And her voice, lower, controlled, unmistakably confident, reframed how femininity could sound. It wasn't fragile. It wasn't reactive. It was dominant. And that dominance didn't reject femininity. It redefined it. Because what audiences saw still fit within the surface of expectation. But the structure underneath was different. Controlled, directed, fully aware of how it would be received. That awareness was the illusion. Not just how she appeared, but how intentionally she shaped that appearance. And once that level of control is sustained, it stops looking like performance. It becomes power. Greer Garson. Calmness can feel natural, but consistency requires control. Greer Garson wasn't just perceived as composed. She was presented that way, repeatedly, without deviation. Her performances carried a steady rhythm. Her voice remained even, rarely rising or breaking. Her expression stayed measured, never excessive, never unpredictable. And that consistency shaped perception. Because when an image doesn't fluctuate, it begins to feel dependable. Garson's presence created a sense of balance. Nothing too sharp, nothing too soft. Everything held within a controlled range. It made her feel trustworthy, familiar, almost reassuring. But that balance didn't happen by chance. Certain reactions were restrained. Certain emotions were softened. The presentation stayed within limits that maintained the same impression, every time. And over time, that impression solidified. Because consistency builds trust, and trust builds belief. The audience doesn't see the control behind it. They only feel the result. And once something feels that stable, it stops being interpreted. It simply becomes accepted as real. Barbara Stanwyck. Softness wasn't always shown. Sometimes it was removed. Barbara Stanwyck didn't build her screen presence around warmth or delicacy. There was no effort to soften her edges or make her feel fragile. Instead, what audiences saw was control, steady, grounded, and deliberate. Her voice carried certainty. Her posture never retreated. Even her emotional moments felt contained rather than exposed. And that restraint changed perception. Because when softness is absent, the audience doesn't focus on what's missing. They focus on what replaces it. In Stanwyck's case, that was strength. Quiet, consistent, and difficult to challenge. Over time, that strength became expected, not as a contrast to femininity, but as its definition within her roles. That's how the illusion formed. Not by adding something artificial, but by removing what people assumed should be there. And once that version was repeated often enough, it stopped feeling like a choice. It became identity. Jean Seberg. Not fully traditional, not entirely unconventional. Jean Seberg didn't fit the image Hollywood had carefully defined for its leading women. At a time when glamour meant styled hair, controlled makeup, and clearly defined femininity, her appearance moved in a different direction. Simpler, sharper, less adorned. Her short hair removed one of the most recognizable markers of traditional beauty. Her styling remained minimal, almost understated. Even her expressions felt lighter, less performed, more natural, but also harder to categorize. And that created something unusual, because when an image doesn't fully match expectation, the audience begins to interpret it differently. Seberg's presence existed in that space, between what was familiar and what wasn't. Not distant enough to feel disconnected, but not aligned enough to feel conventional. And that in-between became the illusion, because ambiguity invites attention. The less defined something is, the more the audience tries to define it themselves. And once they do, the perception feels personal, not assigned, not controlled. But in reality, it was still being shaped, just more subtly than before. Lana Turner. Glamour doesn't maintain itself. It's reinforced. Lana Turner didn't just appear glamorous. She was kept that way, constantly, carefully, without interruption. The image audiences recognized wasn't allowed to shift, not even slightly. Hair remained flawless. Makeup followed a precise standard. Lighting softened every edge, every shadow. every imperfection that might disrupt the illusion. Because glamour, once established, becomes expectation. And expectation doesn't tolerate inconsistency. Every public appearance, every photograph, every role had to align with the same version. There was no room for deviation, no space for anything that felt ordinary or unpolished. The illusion had to remain intact at all times. That's what made it powerful. Not just how it looked, but how consistently it was maintained. Because consistency builds familiarity, and familiarity builds belief. Over time, the audience stops seeing effort. They stop noticing control. What remains is the image, unchanging, flawless, unquestioned. And once something appears that's stable, it no longer feels constructed. It feels real. Marilyn Monroe. Some illusions don't just shape perception, they replace reality. Marilyn Monroe wasn't simply presented to the world. She was constructed, layer by layer, until the construction felt complete. Before the image, there was Norma Jean, a different presence, a different rhythm, a person who didn't fully match what Hollywood believed audiences wanted to see. So, adjustments were made. Her voice softened, slowed into something more deliberate. Her movements became measured, almost carefully timed. Even silence was shaped. Pauses held just long enough to create a specific impression. None of it was accidental. Every detail was guided toward a single, recognizable version. And once that version was introduced, it had to be maintained. That's where the illusion deepened. Because repetition creates familiarity, and familiarity creates belief. Audiences didn't see the construction. They saw consistency, and consistency feels real. Over time, the image stopped feeling like a performance. It became expectation. And when expectation becomes strong enough, it begins to overwrite everything that came before. Hollywood didn't need impossible secrets. It had something more powerful, control over perception. Not just how these women looked, but how you understood them. And once that understanding is shaped long enough, it stops feeling shaped at all. So the question isn't what was hidden, it's whether any of it was real, or just something you were trained to believe.